All right, that looks like things are in place. So let's go ahead and get back to work. Okay, well, I hope everybody is ready for another discussion of the elements of the Mishkan and its accessories. In this particular day, we're going to be looking at the accessories of the Kohen, in particular the Kohen Gadol. There are clothes for both regular Kohanim as well as clothes for the Kohen Gadol, and a lot more time is spent on those of the Kohen Gadol. Now, as I always say, during this period of study, there's no way to go into detail about everything. However, we will pick one slice and delve deep. Some of the classes I've done in the past, which should be cataloged in YouTube, in these parshiot of the end of Book of Exodus, will cover other topics. So if I haven't covered it yet, let me know. If I have covered it, check it out. So let's get down to work. As usual, we're not going to be able to read the entire parasha. I tried that for a while, or at least getting a larger chunk. And it turns out that, it's just impossible to read the entire Torah portion in an hour with any sort of commentary at all. While it's still very fruitful to read the entirety of the Torah every week, even without commentary, it's still very important to just get through it and familiarize yourself with the topics and the basic outlines of what's going on. Study does take more time. So let's go ahead and pick up in chapter 28, verse 30, here in Parashat Tetzaveh. And you are to put in the breastpiece of judgment, the Urim and Tumim, and they may be over Aaron's heart, that they may be over Aaron's heart, whenever he comes before the presence of Adonai. So Aaron is to bear the breastpiece of judgment for the children of Israel over his heart before the presence of Adonai regularly, or always, as Tamid could sometimes be translated. Now, this starts off with a topic that we have discussed in previous classes, but I want to contrast it with where we head from here. It is very powerful to read the description of the Choshen Mishpat, the breastpiece that he wore, the cloth that was embroidered and then had the 12 stones representing each of the tribes set into it, the shoulder pieces of the Urim and Tumim that were put into the fold inside the breastpiece itself. There's so much to say. It is used in both halachic as well as mystical understanding of the ancient world. But we're not going to stop here. Like I said, we've talked about this before. So I want to make sure that we continue and look at some of the other elements that he wore to see that down to the smallest detail, there is much to learn. So we'll continue in verse 31. You are to make the tunic for the ephod completely of blue violet, this techelet, beautiful color. It's the same color for the tzitzit. Its head opening is to be in its middle. There shall be a seam for its opening all around of weaver's making, like the opening of armor. It is to be for him. It is not to be split. So this is the overall tunic that he is wearing on the external layer. You are to make on its skirts pomegranates of blue, violet, purple, and warm scarlet on its skirts all around, and bells of gold amidst them all around. So at the bottom hem, there are going to be these, rimonim, these pomegranates. Now, you may be more familiar with the phrase rimonim as referring to the finials that rest on top of the rollers of a Torah scroll while it is set in the ark. And indeed, that is the term that we use for them, whether they are shaped like pomegranates or not. And in fact, those rimonim, those finials that we have on our Torah scrolls, are a direct descendant of this particular passage. The fact is that they are there to create that lovely bell-like sound as the Torah is carried around during the hakafot, the processionals during the service. We may not have a Kohen Gadol to have small bells on his skirt, but we can still have these bells on our rimonim in our service. Now, we're going to have to come back and look at this in more detail because while all the other elements make sense from either a plain, practical, common sense way or through some rather obvious midrashic or halachic implications, these bells and the pomegranates around them don't really seem to add much. And while I'm sure the most obvious answer you're thinking to yourself is that it's pretty, that's not really a sufficient reason for it to be a commandment. While it is certainly true that Judaism has a fine artistic history, where craftsmanship to embellish the performance of mitzvot has been absolutely incredible, and you can check out some of the amazing Jewish museums, many of which have their catalogs online to peruse, to see the handiwork of Jewish craftsmanship over the last couple thousand years. We believe in hidur mitzvah, the beautification of a mitzvah through fine handiwork. But we don't make it a commandment. Just case in point, if you were to need to do Kiddush and the only thing you had was a paper cup, you do Kiddush in a paper cup. You don't say, I can't do Kiddush because my cup is too plain, my cup is not nice enough. You do Kiddush in the cup that you've got. Now, it may be customary for people to have invested in a nicer cup that is set aside just for Kiddush, whether it be made of glass, whether it be made of silver, or some other upmarket kind of construction. That is certainly true as a common custom, but it is not a commandment. So to explain these rimonim, these pomegranates and these bells as being just for decoration is missing the point that this entire section is in fact a set of commandments. This is not God giving fashion advice. This is God giving commanded advice. As such, we will look into what these bells might have been commanded to achieve. But before we finish that, let's continue their description as well as the rest of the chapter. Verse 34, bell of gold and pomegranate, bell of gold and pomegranate, all on the skirt of the robe all around. So these were alternating so that there would be this bell, and then there would be this pomegranate decoration. Bell, pomegranate, and so on. Verse 35, it is to be put on Aaron for attending, that its sound may be heard whenever he comes into the holy shrine and before the presence of Adonai, and whenever he goes out, so that he does not die. If we needed any clearer any clearer statement that this is not just about decoration, well, here in verse 35 we have it. Apparently, these bells, because that's the sound that we are describing here, are so important that they are in some way connected to preserving Aaron's life in his comings and goings within the holy tabernacle, the Mishkan. So yeah, this is not just decorative embroidery. This has a fundamental purpose. Of course, we do not yet know exactly what that purpose is. One of the reasons why we have to study. We can get sort of the upshot. We want the sound. Somehow this is keeping him from being killed. But we're going to have to investigate with the help of our commentators a little bit more. Verse 36, though, so we can round out the section. You are to make a plate of pure gold and are to engrave on it signet engravings, holiness for Adonai. This is the forehead piece that gets worn, that seats. You are to place on it a thread of blue violet, that techelet again, that it may be on the turban. On the forefront of the turban it is to be. It is to be on Aaron's brow, so Aaron is to bear the iniquity of the holy offering, so the children of Israel offer as holy all their gifts of holiness. It is to be on his brow regularly, for receiving favor for them before the presence of Adonai. You are to braid the tunic of byssus, and you are to make the turban of byssus, and a sash you are to make of embroiderer's making. So we're moving on from this seats to the tunic as well as this turban that is worn, and the sash. And for the sons of Aharon, meaning the other Kohanim, you are to make tunics, and you are to make them sashes and caps. You are to make for them for glory and for splendor. You are to clothe them in Aaron. You are to clothe in them Aaron your brother and his sons with him. Remember, this is addressed originally to Moses. You are to anoint them. You are to give mandate to them. You are to hallow them, that they may be priests for me. You are to make them breeches of linen. This is a type of pants, trousers, to cover the flesh of their nakedness. From the hips to the thighs they are to extend. They are to be on Aaron and his sons whenever they come into the tent of appointment, or whenever they approach the altar to attend at the holy shrine, that they do not bear iniquity and die. A law for the ages, for him and for his seed after him, meaning for all of the Kohanim officiating in the Mishkan or then later in the temple. All right, so that is bringing us to the end of our chapter 28. Like I said, we're going to be delving into the bells in more detail. But if you have any other questions that are straightforward enough that we can answer them without doing an entire another class, go ahead and let me know. Let's double check our YouTube questions. All right, I'm not seeing anybody, so let's go ahead and dive into our commentaries. Hello. Why is my PDF not this? Ah, there we go. Okay, technology, yes, scared me for a second. Okay, so let's talk about this in the first, most plain way. Rashbam, one of my favorite commentaries, because he is one of the commentaries that actually really does try to look just at the basic meaning of the text. And when he's asking about these bells and pomegranates, what are we going to know? The golden bells will knock against each other, even though they are separated from one another by the woolen pomegranates. Now, if you had not been visualizing this, Rashbam is making it clear that there is a wool pomegranate, and then there is a bell, and then there is a wool pomegranate, a little sort of ball shaped of the wool loops, and then another bell, and so on. So they are alternating. And he is answering what should be a very pragmatic question of, if there is a wool piece in between each of the metal bells, then how are the bells going to tinkle? What are they hitting against? And he's pointing out that, yes, if you were to draw it in a straight line, bell is not touching bell. But if you realize that this is a loose hem of a tunic type of material, of a sort of almost like an apron, then the bottom is not rigid. It's going to continue to fold. And indeed, despite the fact that they are alternating with these woolen pomegranates, these rimonim, they are still going to clack against each other, and there is still going to be the tinkling sound that comes from the bell. So, problem solved. Rashbam, in all of his practicality, helps us understand how this will actually work for making sound. Great. But obviously, we still don't know why we need to make sound and why it is such a serious issue that the phrase of not die is attached to it. So let's jump into Bechor Shor and come into this from a more ethical point of view. So that the sound of it is heard, our introductory phrase, so that he should not come before me, meaning God, like a thief tunneling in, something we learned about in Parashat Mishpatim. And we learn proper conduct from this, meaning for our own lives, that a person should not enter his fellow's house suddenly, lest he is doing or saying something private. But if he hears him coming, he will be able to hide from him, meaning to stop the private matter. This is good etiquette, says Bechor Shor, that just as the Kohanim is coming into God's presence more powerfully when he walks into the Mishkan and the Holy of Holies at the back, we should recognize that as he is announcing his approach, remembering the verse talks about his coming and going, then so too, we should learn that when we approach each other, that we too should announce our approach. A simple knock will suffice, or something, some other way of making sure that someone knows that we are coming. Now, you might be thinking, well, who would ever enter a house without knocking? Well, I don't know about you, but I was raised with reruns of I Love Lucy, and certainly neighbors were coming into each other's houses, and especially kitchens, with frequent regularity, without waiting for the formality of being invited after a knock. It was sort of a walkthrough. Now, I know that was somewhat for the convenience of television, but it is true that for many, many thousands of years, and especially smaller communities, close friends would assume that they had access to each other's homes, because that's what you did, to go and say hi to someone. But Bechor Shor is saying, yes, absolutely, but you still need to announce yourself. Don't just go barging through the door into the next room. You need to actually let them know. Good, ethical, but lo yamut, that he won't die. I mean, it's a wonderful ethical insight and good reminder that we should treat each other with dignity. But that doesn't really seem to be significant enough to warrant all of the language we've had so far of the seriousness of this particular commandment. Well, let's keep going. Moving on to Rashi. From what is included in this negative statement, remember, negative statements in Torah study means something that is a lest it not happen kind, or not that it should not happen. It's not negative in the sense of bad. It's negative in the grammatical sense, that there is a negative phrasing. From what is included in this negative statement, you may infer the positive. So that he will not die implies that he will live. If he has these garments on him, he will not incur death. Consequently, if he enters the sanctuary lacking one of these garments, he incurs death at the hands of God. And the quote is coming from the Talmud in Sanhedrin 83. All right, so Rashi is trying to shape this statement in a little bit more detail, perhaps not going as far as we want. Don't worry, we have other commentaries that will. But what he is trying to say is that this is not a to keep you from dying type commandment. This is what you should be doing kind of commandment. It's just phrased in the negative form, but we should read in it the entirety of the positive commandments, meaning that the Kohen Gadol has to wear all of these things. Now, you will notice that Rashi makes a jump here based off the Talmud, that it is in fact all of the garments that has to be worn, or that have to be worn in order to avoid a problem when entering into the Holy of Holies. It is not only these bells, but in fact, all of them need to be worn. Now, we're going to see somebody who disagrees and wants to take issue with Rashi's discussion here, but we need to make sure that we understand that Rashi is expanding our verse to describe all of the garments that need to be worn, not only the ephod and its bells. All right, so how could anyone take issue with that? I mean, after all, it's Rashi, and everybody knows Kulo Emes, as they say in yeshiva speak, that Rashi is wholly true. And while it is certainly true that Rashi has a huge standing within the history of our commentators, and even when he is drawing from sources found in the earlier strata of rabbinic knowledge, like here from the Talmud, there is still room to debate and discuss, and sometimes disagree with either his phrasing of previous teachings, or of his interpretation of them, or even of his selection. For often there is more than one text in earlier strata, and Rashi may have only brought one, or may have brought one that he has significantly phrased in a way that another commentary may disagree with. So let's take a look at Rashi's most frequent critic, which is Ramban, also known as Nachmanides, originally of Spain. Rashi does not appear to me to be correct. And this is a very familiar phrase if you study Ramban. For if so, God should have written this verse after having mentioned all 8 garments. And why did he mention it after 3 garments? So as you noticed, when we began our reading, we were already talking about the Choshen Mishpat, about the breastpiece, and then we went on after talking about the ephod to talk about the tzitz and the turban and the tunic and the sash. This admonition of lest he die, or so he will not die, comes in the middle of the listing of the garments. If Rashi is trying to tell us that the Kohen needs to wear all of these in order to avoid death, and that's what this particular phrase is talking about, then that seems a little illogical. Because if God wanted to make us understand this statement was connected to all 8 garments, then put it at the end of the list. Indeed, we even have a mention of and not die at the end of the list of the garments. It doesn't seem to make sense, says Ramban, to add another admonition in the middle when we haven't even finished what is required to be worn. Furthermore, because Ramban is never satisfied with just one explanation, and when he comes out that he not die, the main trigger phrase that means that's referred to here, that doesn't seem to work. But the act of going out is no function for which he should incur death if lacking the garments. He's pointing out, and I'll show you the whole verse to make it clear, that it's not just when he comes into the holy shrine, as Rashi is putting it, but it's also when he goes out. And the fact that our verse here, verse 35, talks not only about when you appear before God, that you need to be wearing something, and Rashi argued all the garments, and that's what our verse is talking about. Our verse also talks about when you leave from having appeared before Adonai, and Rashi's statement doesn't seem to explain why the exit still revolves around what you are wearing. How do the garments as a whole matter for the exit? I mean, no one was expecting the Kohen Gadol to strip down while he's in the Holy of Holies. So this phrase cannot just mean keep your clothes on. It has to mean that there is something special happening in verse 35 about both entering and exiting from that encounter with God. As such, Ramban argues that Rashi's explanation is insufficient, or indeed incorrect. I know in many modern circles, people would faint at the thought of someone saying Rashi is incorrect, but Ramban had no problem with it. Now, Ramban takes another lengthy discussion in the middle here, but for the sake of our pace and time, we're going to continue near the end of his analysis. And that which he, God, said, and the sound thereof shall be heard when he goes into the holy place before the eternal, and when he goes out, that he not die, our verse 35, is, in my opinion, an explanation for the commandment of the bells upon the robe, since there was no need to wear them, nor are they customary amongst dignitaries. All right, like I said, God would not have commanded us to wear something out of practical, or that had no practical need, or that didn't at least match a customary need. We'll come back to that customary need in just a minute. So there has to be a specific reason for the commandment of wearing these bells. It's not practicality, and it's not just, well, that's what people do when they're dressing fancy. Therefore, it has to have its own explanation. And according to Ramban, its own explanation is tied up with this verse 35. Therefore, he, God, said that he commanded that they be made in order that the sound be heard in the sanctuary, that the priest enter before his master as if with permission. For he who comes into the king's palace suddenly incurs the penalty of death according to the court ceremonial, just as we find in the case of Achashverosh. Okay. So Ramban links our bells to the story of Purim, and indeed to courtly etiquette in general. Ramban did have many dealings with the various dignitaries of the medieval world, so he was familiar in his world that one does not simply walk in to the throne room. Certainly, we see this explicitly in the story of Purim, where Esther has to risk death by coming unannounced to visit the king and plead for the life of her people. But it was not only the Persian kings that had such etiquette. That seems like too weak of a word. Not only those Persian kings that had that kind of requirement, indeed, most monarchs have rules about what you have to do before you get to see the king. And what Ramban is saying is that these bells are in fact fulfilling that rule. Indeed, this is taking Bechor Shor's idea, although he did come later, and trying to turn it from not only an ethical teaching, but into this commandment between us and God. that when we approach Hamelech, when we approach the king, that we do so in a way that shows the gravity of our position. And when the Kohen Gadol went into the Holy of Holies, all the more so, he was doing so in a way that would properly announce his arrival, in order that this be properly framed as though he were coming to greet a king. There's no courtiers to sound a trumpet. There's no one to bang a stick and announce the arrival. And so these bells, which otherwise would seem useless, were added to his garments in order that this be fulfilled. Thus, Ramban has an explanation for why the commandment of wearing these bells. All right, we'll leave that there. Any questions? Let me touch back on our YouTube group. Make sure nobody is typing away there. All right. So the bells are an announcement, because you must announce yourself if you are walking into the Holy of Holies. Esther had to worry about death if she didn't do it properly with Achashverosh. Well, God is certainly a better king than Achashverosh, thus it's needed. But maybe there's more that we can say about this. And that's where we're going to continue on here. Let's see. Can I get both of these on the same page? I think I can just about. Sometimes, come on, I don't like to have to scroll while reading, because it's hard on my eyes, and I think it's hard on those that are watching this on a device. Okay. So continuing with our analysis of its sound will be heard when he enters the holy precincts. Rabbeinu Bachya says, when Aaron enters the sanctuary dressed in his 8 special vestments, fancy word for clothes, his voice in prayer will be heard by God, and his prayers will be accepted. All right, that is the basic idea, as we're sort of bringing from Rashi here, that he needs to be in this proper attire. Why? Not just because God is a stickler, but because this is sort of the prerequisite for the prayers, which are on behalf of the entire nation, being acceptable. In addition to the sound of his voice in prayer, there will also be heard the sound of the bells at the hem of his robe. So now these bells are not just a ding, 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 ding announcing bell, but they are also blending together with his own voice and the sound of his own prayer, becoming sort of a harmony. This little verse is a lesson in manners. When a person wishes to receive an audience, he first knocks on the door of the king or prefect from whom he requests the audience, just like we talked about with Ramban, and in another degree, Bechor Shor. Aaron the high priest would announce his intention to pray by means of chiming of the bells of his robe. What is a customary sign of deference to a mortal king must be observed when one petitions the King of Kings. So this is a brilliant little summary of much of Jewish custom, much that is often confusing, especially to a newcomer. What is a customary sign of deference to a mortal king must also be observed when one petitions the King of Kings. So I often will remind people, if you were going to meet the king, or here in the States, if I say, if you were going to meet the president, or at least a president that you respected, although we should always respect the office. Politics can get a little messy, especially these days. But if you are going to meet the head of state, what would you do? And, obvious things are, well, I'm not going in my sweatpants. I'm not going without having, cleaned off any sweat or dirt and other types of things. I'm not going and I'm not going to approach him and speak too casually or too familiarly. I will show proper deference and respect in my speech. Well, what Rabbeinu Bachya is reminding us, that anything that we imagine we would do upon meeting a powerful and important human being, a ruler of state in this realm, we must also do when approaching God. Now, it's not that God demands those things the same way that a flesh and blood king might demand those things. It is because we mentally prepare ourselves for a person that we wish to show respect, and we will notice if those preparations are lacking if we go to attend to God. It is a wonderful little wrinkle of human psychology that the ways we show respect to each other also make us feel more respect towards someone, and that if we show them that respect, we will respect them more. And if we do not show them that respect, then psychologically, our respect for them will diminish. It's very unusual for many of us to think, because we imagine ourselves governed purely by a rational voice in our mind or some such. But how we behave changes how we feel, just as much as how we feel changes how we behave. As such, if we know that when you approach a king, you do so hesitatingly, that you will bow, that you will always have your words as polite and respectful as possible, and then we approach God and don't do those things, emotionally, we would feel less from our encounter with the divine. We would feel that it was less important because we hadn't behaved the right way. So when you are in a service and you notice that people will be taking small steps at the beginning of the Amidah, of bowing, or at the end, retreating, bowing to different directions as a sign of respect to God's entourage, because that's how one would treat a flesh and blood king's entourage. Recognize this is not because we literally believe that God demands a bow the same way that a human demands a bow, but recognize that since we would bow to a human, we are obligated to bow to God all the more so, because we cannot show God any less respect than we would show a human whom we wish to respect. So very important, very powerful psychological summary there. If it's how you treat a flesh and blood king, then God gets that too. Not because God wants it, but because you need to know that you are showing God that respect. When one arrives unannounced in a mortal king's palace, enters without preamble, one incurs the death penalty, just as Ramban said. Similarly, when the high priest enters God's sanctuary, it behooves him to give notice of his intention to enter. The matter is best illustrated in Esther 4:11, like we discussed, from where we know that King Ahasuerus looked with great suspicion on anyone who came unannounced, and, generally speaking, had such persons executed, as he thought they were bent on harming him, and indeed Ahasuerus had many plots against him. Even though God, of course, is fully aware of the intentions of the, quote, intruder, meaning it's not as though God doesn't know why we are coming or the Kohen is coming, the same rules of etiquette apply in the sanctuary. Again, we have to follow the same rules that we would to a human king, and this is the way we fulfill it through these tingling little bells. All right. Any questions or comments? Okay, not seeing any on YouTube, and no one seems to be raising a hand here. Then we are going to shift gears. So these are what we've discussed so far are very practical and very psychological reasons of why God would command that the hem be built in exactly this way with these bells and such. However, the Talmud has here, the Yerushalmi Talmud has a different way of looking at all of the garments, and they look at them as being elements, not just of the decoration of the Kohen or even of the emotions of the Kohen, but as fulfilling a practical function within the rituals of the Kohen, in particular for trying to provide atonement, kapara. And as we'll see, there are some tricky situations of kapara, and this is going to try and bring it together for us. Rabbi Shimon, in the name of Rabbi Yonatan of Bet Givrin, for two things there was no atonement, but the Torah established atonement for them. Meaning there are two things that there's no real way to fix them and then be like, okay again, to have wiped the slate clean. But the Torah did find a way that we could have that. What are they? One who spreads slander, lashon hara, wicked speech about another person, and the involuntary homicide, what we might call manslaughter in modern American law, where a person accidentally kills someone else. Let's examine each. For him who spread slander, there was no atonement. I mean, look, you have besmirched someone else. There is no way to atone for that. But the Torah fixed atonement for them. What was it? The bells of the coat. It shall be on Aaron in service, and its sound be heard. the sound may come to atone for the sound. All right, so why did it need to have that word sound? Well, precisely because there are certain mitzvot that are violated purely by sound. It's not like theft, where one can return what was stolen. It's not like injury to another person, by hitting them, which can be rectified by paying for the healing, the damages, etc. Well, it's very hard to fix the sound of lashon hara, of gossip and slander. So the sound of the bells comes as a way to cancel out the sound of that slander, and with proper teshuvah allows it to be atoned for, so that we not carry on that sin once we have made proper efforts to fix what we have done. Likewise, for the involuntary manslaughter, there was no atonement, but the Torah established atonement for them, the death of the high priest. As it says in the Torah, he shall dwell there until the high priest's death. You would normally think that somebody who had committed involuntary manslaughter and was hiding in a city of refuge would be stuck there forever. But the Torah added that with the death of the high priest, that indeed even those that had committed this accidental murder could then be released from living only in the city of refuge. In a way, the death of the high priest provided atonement, provided a wiping of the slate clean to allow him to leave. Now, we're going to focus more, of course, on those bells, in particular with regards to the issue of malicious speech, of lashon hara, this time taken from the Babylonian Talmud. The robe of the high priest atones for malicious speech. As the Holy One, blessed be he, says, let an item that produces sound, the bells of the robe, come and atone for an act of malicious sound, malicious speech. All right, so first of all, just as an academic aside, notice that the Bavli, which was written a few hundred years after the Yerushalmi, is a much more edited work. Many consider it to be a more elegant way of presenting the various ideas that the Yerushalmi discusses. It's not better. Don't get into a fandom argument over this, but it does try to shape the discussion a little bit more clearly. Now, obviously, this particular translation also has additional assistance in it that the Yerushalmi does not have quite as much of, but even still, it is a little clearer what's going on here. Now, it continues, however. The statement of Rabbi Anai bar Sasson indicated that the robe worn by the high priest atones for malicious speech, which means that one is not punished by tzara'at, as claimed by Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. So earlier on in this section, it's a much longer piece in the Talmud. That's why we have the little ellipse here. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says that the atonement for lashon hara comes through tzara'at, often translated as leprosy, which the book of Leviticus deals with in much detail. The idea being that one who has privately slandered someone will then publicly manifest through tzara'at, this skin affliction, as well as the affliction that can go through a house and its walls, in order to expose what they have been doing. However, this text that we just read said that the bells provide that atonement. That seems like a contradiction. And the Talmud does not like just blanket contradictions. Sometimes, yes, we just have to agree to disagree, if you will, and say two different rabbis have very different opinions. But sometimes we can find a way to reconcile. And that is what we'll do today. This is not difficult. There's no contradiction. Here, the statement of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani is referring to a case where the actions were effective and caused damage, meaning that the affliction of tzara'at comes upon a person who gossiped about another, and that gossip had caused actual damage to the person that was targeted. There, the other case, Rabbi Anani bar Sasson is referring to a case where his actions were not effective. So, if his actions were effective and caused harm and quarrels, leprous marks come upon him as punishment. If his actions were not effective and did not cause any damage, the robe atones for his sins. So if his actions had a physical presence in the world, then he will have a physical sign upon himself that will provide the path for him to atone. On the other hand, if his words had no lasting physical presence in the world, they did not cause any real damage, nonetheless, they still need to be atoned for. And in this case, it is the countersound of the bells that provides that atonement with his own proper reflection and teshuvah, repentance. So we are finding out here not only that there's no contradiction, but that indeed malicious speech, even when it doesn't actually cause, quote, real damage, is still problematic and still needs atonement and still needs teshuvah. We may think, oh, well, so-and-so didn't even know that I said this about them. It didn't really cause any harm, or I may have spread some rumors, but no one took them seriously. So, what's the problem? No, it is still a problem. Obviously, it's not as bad as if you had caused lasting damage to somebody, but it is still something that needs to be avoided and something that still needs to be atoned for if you are doing so. The Gemara continues. With regard to the apparent contradiction between one statement dealing with malicious speech and the other statement about malicious speech, it is also not difficult, as in this, the incense atones for malicious speech spoken in private, whereas the robe atones for malicious speech spoken in public. Further on in this section of the Talmud in Arifin, and you can see by my little ellipse that we had to skip it in order to fit everything on a page. There is another tradition that says it is the incense, the ephemeral smoke that was offered in the temple and Mishkan before that, that provides atonement for Lashon Hara. But as we already discussed, the bells provide atonement for Lashon Hara. How do we reconcile this? Well, says the Talmud again, there is no contradiction here. The bells atone for malicious speech that was done publicly, and the incense atones for malicious speech that was done privately. What do we learn from this? We learn that it is prohibited to attack a person with malicious speech and cause damage. It is prohibited to attack a person with malicious speech in public, even if it doesn't cause damage. And it is prohibited to attack a person with malicious speech, even in private, and even if it causes no damage. It's almost as though Lashon Hara is just wrong in each of these different manifestations. Now, why would the rabbis go through such effort to attach this particular sin of Lashon Hara, of malicious speech, to all of these different elements of the rituals of the temple? Well, honestly, it's because this would make people take them more seriously. If you can actually visualize that Tzara'at, that the bells, that the incense, all of which were considered to be part of the splendor or the miracles of how the temple service worked, you can attach that to Lashon Hara in a way that most other mitzvot have no analog, then it elevates the seriousness of this particular commandment. It makes people pay more attention. The problem with Lashon Hara, of course, is that most people treat our gossip and slander as though it was a trivial thing. And the rabbis were very conscious that it needed to be taken much more seriously in the minds of it. They recognized that this was something that could cause irreparable harm to not only an individual, but to a community if it got out of hand. Going all the way back to our beginning comment from Bechor Shor, this is about proper conduct, about knocking when you enter, about not barging into the privacy of someone else's life, and certainly not about exposing that privacy to the rest of the world. It's not about, well, if you got nothing to hide. Judaism doesn't play that game. You have a right to privacy. You have a right not to be gossiped about. You have a right not to have others slander your good name. Importantly, even if they are telling the truth, if it is not truth that is kind and not truth that needs to be shared, meaning there's no attendant danger, it's not as though they saw you committing a crime, but it's just something they know will turn others against you, then you do not share this. And you don't share it in public to cause harm. You don't share it in public without causing harm, and you don't even share it in private. All of these bells are reminding us of the importance of this mitzvah of sound when we go out, when we come in, that this is about being in the proper, with the proper respect and dignity that we would show God, as the Kohen was commanded, and that we should show each other. So when you hear the tinkling of those bells on the Sifrei Torah, when we carry them around the sanctuary, hearing them not only the call of the Kohen, not only the reminder of the beautiful of the beauty of the ceremonies of our past, but also of a reminder to watch the sounds that we create, to make sure that we too are properly governing what it is that we say, so that things will be good for us when we go and when we come. And if there are no questions, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you all so much for joining me to study, and for anybody that's watching this later, thank you for tuning in later as well. A reminder that I'm always available for additional discussion or questions, and if there are other topics that you would like me to explore, just let me know. Take care, everyone, and be well.